영어 동화 세상 리틀 박스.
The Prince and the Pauper, Chapter 1. The Prince and the Pauper. The birth of a baby is usually a joyous occasion. It certainly was for the King and Queen of England one day in the 16th century. When their son was born, the entire country celebrated with feasts and jubilant dancing and singing. From the moment Edward, the Prince of Wales, entered the world, his life was a privileged and sheltered one. But on that very same day, shouts of a different sort were heard in another part of London. These were not cries of joy, but rather shouts of anger. For on that day, Tom Canty was born into a very poor family, dominated by his boorish father, John. The Cantys lived in a squalid part of London, in a section known as Offal Court. Their home consisted of just one room, with piles of straw and old blankets thrown about for beds. During the day, Tom and his older twin sisters were sent out to the streets to beg. If Tom returned home empty-handed, his father would beat him and then send him to bed with nothing to eat. Yet Tom was not unhappy. He was still a young boy who did not yet know how bad his circumstances were. And he had a mother and sisters who loved him dearly and tried to take care of him, despite the abuses of his father. Tom also had a friend in Offal Court. Kind Father Andrew told Tom tales about magical things, giants, fairies, enchanted castles. Stories of kings living in splendor distracted Tom from his own life as he imagined how wonderful it might be to live in luxury. Father Andrew also taught Tom how to read and write. From the priest, Tom even learned Latin, a language not normally spoken by those living in the city slums. People in Offal Court soon began to look up to Tom Canty, who was quite poor, but acted instead as if he were a wise and wealthy nobleman. Still, Tom's gifts and many admirers did not stop his father's cruel treatment of him. In fact, it made it worse. Tom was forced to bring home double what his sisters did. And if he did not meet his father's demands, the boy faced severe punishment. One day, Tom was out begging on one of London's busiest streets when his father unexpectedly appeared. "Empty your pockets," John Canty growled. "But father, it's only mid-morning," Tom stammered, for he had collected nothing so far. "Are you trying to deceive me? You think you're so clever, don't you?" Tom's father pushed him roughly. Something snapped inside poor Tom. Tired of his father's abuse and longing for something more, Tom turned around and raced away, fleeing both Offal Court and his angry father. Before long, Tom realized that he had reached the city's edge, the farthest he had ever traveled from home. Beautiful buildings with wide gardens appeared before him. Tom stared in amazement at the magnificent structures he had imagined so many times while listening to Father Andrew. Now here they were, for real. Suddenly he froze. Even a poor beggar like Tom could recognize a king's home. Outside an enormous palace, colossal granite lions guarded each side of a stone gateway. Tom stared in wonder. Might he catch a glimpse of a prince? A real prince? It was as if heaven had heard his silent prayers. A moment later, through the bars of a gate that led into a courtyard, he spied a boy practicing swordsmanship. The lad, about his age, was dressed in bejeweled silks and a feathered crimson cap. "A prince! A living prince!" Tom thought, leaning in closer. "Step away at once, dirty beggar!" a soldier shouted. He hauled Tom away from the gate and sent him sprawling on the ground. Passers-by stopped and jeered at the lad. Then a different voice rang out. "How dare you treat him like that?" cried the boy from the courtyard. The people who had gathered around Tom suddenly lowered their heads and bowed. "Long live Edward, the Prince of Wales!" they shouted. "Open the gates and let him through," ordered the prince. The soldiers quickly obeyed, and before Tom knew it, he was standing before Prince Edward. Edward dismissed all the servants. "You look hungry and tired," he said to Tom. Then he led him to his private chambers in the palace. "What is your name?" asked Edward. "Tom Canty," Tom replied. Quickly he added, Your Highness." "Where do you reside, Tom Canty?" Tom noticed that Edward was rolling something like a large coin around in his hand. "Awful Court," Tom said. Then, for the next few minutes, Tom answered questions about his family. When Edward heard about John Canty, the prince nodded knowingly. "I believe our fathers are alike. Mine does not hit me, but his tongue can be cruel." "My mother is good to me," Tom went on. "You speak well, Tom Canty," the prince observed. "Father Andrew taught me, sir. I can speak Latin, too," Tom said proudly. "Latin is easier than Greek," said Edward with a sigh. "I must spend 4 hours a day mastering a language I do not wish to learn." "Then why do you do it?" asked Tom. Edward answered with a question of his own. "What do you do all day?" Tom told Edward of how he and his friends raced one another and watched puppet shows. Sometimes they swam in the river or just played along its muddy banks. Edward listened wistfully. "You have so much freedom," he murmured. He thought for a moment. "I wonder what it would be like to dress in a poor boy's clothes." "Excuse me?" Tom said. "I'd like to experience those things you've described," Edward went on. "Just once, I'd like to play in the mud along the river." Tom blinked in surprise as Edward asked him to exchange clothing. But he quickly agreed to the unusual request, and soon they stood together in front of the mirror. "Do you see what I see?" whispered the prince. Tom could only nod, for not only were the two boys similar in age and height, they were almost identical in looks. "Let me fix that for you, sir," said Tom, adjusting the ragged cap sitting on the prince's head. "What happened to your hand?" Edward pointed to a bruise on Tom's hand. "It must have happened when I fell," Tom replied. "That guard behaved most shamefully," declared Edward. "Now, I command you to stay here until I return." Then he threw open the door and strode out. As Edward passed a suit of armor, Tom saw him drop something into its open palm. Edward reached the courtyard gate, where he shook his fist at the guard who had treated Tom roughly. "You! Unbar the gate!" The soldier stared in disbelief at the boy wearing rags, but he opened the gate and grabbed Edward roughly as the prince strode through. "Remove your hands!" Edward shouted. "I am the prince!" The soldier scoffed. "The prince? You're a dirty beggar! Get out of here!" With that, the soldier tossed Edward, the Prince of Wales, onto the roadway. The Prince and the Pauper, Chapter 2. The Troubles Begin. In just a few minutes, the lives of Tom Canty and Prince Edward had been completely reversed. Edward, the true Prince of Wales, found himself locked outside the gates of his palace, with his own soldiers ignoring his demands to be let back inside. "I am the prince!" Edward cried in vain. Finally, he turned around to face the crowd who'd been watching the scene. "My good people," he began, "honor yourselves by acknowledging your prince." He held out his hand. "Kiss that disgusting hand!" a voice cried. "I'd rather kiss an old boot!" The crowd roared with laughter. Taunting Edward, they chased him down the street. Soon, Edward found himself in an unfamiliar area. He approached a group of boys who were playing with something that looked like a dead rat. "Young citizens, your prince needs help," Edward called. The boys stopped playing and sauntered over. "You're a prince, are you?" one boy sneered. Edward nodded. "Escort me back to the palace, and you will be rewarded." The boys jeered at him. Then they rolled up their sleeves and began circling him. Now we'll show you reverence, your majesty. Some kept on taunting him, while others pummeled him with their fists. Edward had been trained by the finest swordsmen of England, but today he had no weapon with which to protect himself. As soon as he could manage it, he darted through an opening in the circle. To his relief, the boys continued jeering, but they let him go. Edward was bruised and covered with mud, but his skirmish with the rude boys had helped him realize something. Those boys have no manners because they have learned nothing better. When I am king, all children will be taught to read and write. Soon the sun began to set. The wind howled, and rain started to fall. The miserable prince forced himself to keep walking. If I can find Tom's home in Awful Court, then I will be saved, he thought. The prince traveled deeper into a maze of squalid alleys, where rickety houses leaned into one another. Edward longed to rest, but that was not to happen. So, you've decided to return, have you? A hand suddenly gripped his neck from behind. Give me what you got, and it had better be 2 days' worth. Edward was too startled to reply. Answer your father, Tom Canty, the man shouted. The prince twisted loose. So you are his father? He blurted out in surprise. Tom told me stories of you. His father? Who in the world do you think you are? John Canty bellowed. Do you not recognize your prince? Edward retorted. Prince! John spat back. Edward turned and ran down the alley, with John chasing after him. While the prince was dealing with these troubles, Tom was still admiring himself in the mirror. True, his hair and face were dirty, but his fine new clothes gave the impression that he was real royalty. If the people of Awful Court could see me now, Tom said, turning this way and that. But 30 minutes later, there was still no sign of the prince. Tom began to worry. What if something happened to him, he thought. The king will blame me. They'll say I stole his clothes. Tom finally decided he'd better go find the prince himself. Just then, a pretty young girl bounded into the room. Have mercy on me, Tom cried, dropping to his knees. The girl looked horrified. Your Majesty, why are you kneeling before me, your cousin, Lady Jane? When Tom lifted his head, Jane screamed. Your face! You have painted yourself with ink! She sniffed him. And what's that terrible smell? Tom stayed on his knees. Please, miss, Tom Canty might be a beggar, but he means no harm. Jane fled from the room, crying. Tom trembled with fear. Oh, no! I will certainly be executed now. Lady Jane quickly sent rumors buzzing through the palace. Something was wrong. The prince had gone mad. Moments later, Tom heard sounds outside the door. Here they come for me, he thought. A group of noblemen entered, but they didn't grab Tom. Instead, they circled him, casting curious glances and whispering among themselves. I can explain everything, Tom burst out. Look, the prince can have these back. He began to remove his garments. Your Majesty, please, implored the men. They gently put Tom in a chair and then lifted him up. Where are you taking me? Tom cried. Your father wishes to see you, answered one man. My father? Tom gulped, imagining John Canty's cruel face. Yes, the king is eager, replied another. King? My father is no king, Tom declared. His madness is worse than we thought, murmured the men. They swiftly carried Tom away. Panicked thoughts whirled inside Tom's head when he realized what was happening. King Henry VIII, the most feared man in England, wants to see me. Surely I'm doomed. Soon, Tom found himself in a dark but grand room. A large man lay upon a high, ornate bed, surrounded by doctors, servants, and other important-looking people. Approach, my prince, the man croaked. Your father wishes to see your handsome face. Someone nudged Tom gently. He moved closer to the bed, on trembling legs. The king peered at him. "So the rumors are true." He stopped to cough. "You are not well. How did this happen, my son?" I... Tom sputtered. The king grabbed Tom's face and stared into his eyes. "Do you recognize me, son?" Tom nodded cautiously. "Yes, but I am not your son. You see, The king began coughing so hard that 3 doctors had to hold him up. Tom tried again to explain. "I'm only a beggar, your royal majesty. I'm not worthy to stand before your greatness. It was only harmless fun. Please, I wish to return to my humble home. I beg you, do not kill me." The king was silent for a while. Then he asked Tom a question in Latin. When Tom answered in the same language, the king was delighted. "No beggar could know Latin," the king declared. "But I speak no Greek," protested Tom, remembering how Edward had told him about disliking Greek. "Your memory is returning," the king said excitedly. "Your language tutor has informed me about your challenges with Greek." A man dressed in a splendid robe leaned down to speak in King Henry's ear. "The state of the prince's health will still be a great concern for many, your majesty." "Yes, Lord Hertford. I will need to distract people from my son's madness." Suddenly the king's face lit up. "The prisoner in the tower!" he shouted. "Yes, your majesty?" The soldiers in the room stepped forward. "I will no longer tolerate his unforgivable crime," the king declared. "His execution will be expedited. The Duke of Norfolk will die tomorrow at sunrise." The soldiers exchanged surprised glances. But the king was quite pleased with himself. "Now everyone will forget about what's happened to Edward's mind." The Prince and the Pauper, Chapter 3, Life as a Prince. A group of noblemen ushered Tom back to Edward's private chambers. His heart felt heavy. Because of the foolish game that he and Edward had played, the 2 of them would be responsible for the Duke of Norfolk's early execution. Tom longed to be alone so he could think of how to correct this terrible mistake. But more than a dozen servants awaited his return. "Please be seated," Tom told them weakly, but everyone remained standing. Lord Hertford, who had accompanied Tom, discreetly whispered in his ear, "Servants are not permitted to be seated in your presence, sir, but you may dismiss them with a sign." "Like this?" asked Tom, waving at the servants. Lord Hertford coughed. "Perhaps a flick of your hand will do." Tom awkwardly moved his hand, and at last the group left the room. "Your father has expressed his wishes," Lord Hertford began. "I'm listening," Tom sighed. No matter how hard he tried to explain his situation, no one believed he was not Edward. So Tom had decided to act like the Prince of Wales until he could straighten things out. "Due to your, present condition," Lord Hertford went on, "the king has instructed that you rest and engage only in activities that delight you. No studying or training for the time being." "I shall obey," said Tom. "But your highness is still required to fulfill his royal duties," continued Hertford. "Such as?" said Tom. "The royal banquet will take place this evening. You promised to attend 2 months ago, as I'm sure your highness will remember." "Oh, of course, the banquet," Tom replied. At that moment, a servant knocked, and Lady Elizabeth and Lady Jane were announced. "Sir, please think of your father's wishes," Hertford whispered in Tom's ear. "Try to remember all that you can, or pretend to remember," he went on. "Do not worry the ladies. Let them see that you're recovering from this strange malady." When Elizabeth and Jane entered, Tom instinctively went to kneel, Hartford instantly pulled him back up. As the girls chatted with Tom, Hartford whispered in his ear from time to time, telling him what to say. The conversation went along without incident, until the girls began praising the king. "How clever your father is," they gushed. "He has mastered several languages and—" "Ha!" Tom burst out, thinking of John Canty. "He is neither clever nor—" Tom trailed off as Hartford shot him a warning look. Then he noticed the shocked expressions on the girls' faces. "Oh, my head," Tom moaned. "It's hurting me again. I don't know what I'm saying." He cradled his head for a moment. The ploy worked. Lady Elizabeth reached for his hands. "My poor prince," she said, sobbing. "Your ladyships, the prince needs rest now," Hartford said gently. The two girls quietly departed with worried, sad faces. Now Tom was not lying. He really did have a headache. "May I have a nap, Lord Hartford?" he asked. "There's no need to ask me permission for anything, sir," replied Hartford. "You may do as you please." Tom flicked his hand, and after bowing, Hartford retreated from the room. "Finally, I'm alone," Tom said aloud. But as soon as he uttered those words, the door opened again. Servants entered, some carrying an item of clothing, while others held basins and water jugs. They stood in a row, awaiting orders. "I can wash my own face, thank you," Tom said. "My lord, please allow us the honor," said an elderly servant. Before Tom could answer, the servants quickly and efficiently removed his garments. Soon his face was scrubbed and his hair washed. Then he was tucked into bed, wearing a silk nightgown. Tom was about to drift off to sleep when he noticed all the servants still standing in the room. "You may go now," Tom said, "and thank you." "But what if you need something while you sleep, sir?" asked a servant. "Oh." Tom didn't know what to say to that. He leaned back on his soft pillows and pulled the covers over his head. His dreams of being a prince had been so pleasant, but now that he'd actually become one, life felt tedious. "Before, I had freedom to wander the streets and play with my friends," Tom thought sadly. "There are many people here, but still I feel alone." Tom drifted off into a fretful sleep, missing his mother and sisters. When he awoke, the same servants still stood in a row, only now they were waiting to dress Tom, piece by piece, for dinner. "This is silly," Tom thought. "I could dress myself in 5 seconds. Now it will take forever." At last Tom was ready, and Hartford escorted him to the banquet. They entered a beautiful dining room, where the assembled guests welcomed the prince with bows and praises. They had been informed that the prince was temporarily out of his head, and ordered not to react to anything unusual that he did. Meanwhile, Tom's eyes bulged when he saw the meal before him. Before he could stop himself, he tore apart the delicious meat with his hands. When he was finished, he licked his fingers. "Delicious!" he declared, groaning in delight. As they'd been instructed, the guests ignored the prince's unusual lack of manners. Soon Tom looked around for a place to wipe his hands, but when a servant brought a white silk napkin, Tom waved it away. "That's too pretty to soil," he said, and wiped his hands on his dark trousers. Tom saw the guests turn away, trying to ignore his bad manners. He wasn't sure what he'd done wrong, but he felt embarrassed. Suddenly his nose began to itch. Not wanting to behave rudely again, Tom said, "My nose itches. May I scratch it?" No one replied. People thought, "This is more of the prince's madness." Tom's nose itched so badly that his eyes watered and tears ran down his face. But he didn't dare scratch. Instead, he desperately grabbed a handful of nuts from a bowl, stuffed his pockets with them, and stood. The guests rose respectfully as Tom left the banquet. Back in his own chambers, Tom just wanted to be alone. As he hastily dismissed all the servants, His eyes landed on the suit of armor that stood near the door. How many times had Father Andrew told him fantastic stories about brave knights dressed in shining armor? Curious, Tom went over to look at it more closely. He was trying on the plumed helmet when he remembered the nuts he'd taken. "I'm still hungry," he thought, "and they will be delicious." Quickly, he pulled the nuts from his pockets and found something to use to crack them open. As he munched on the treat, Tom felt relaxed for the first time that day.